Hello, everybody, and welcome back to You Exchange, the podcast where I exchange my user experiences to change them, and yours for the better. I'm Jeremy, a mentor and senior user researcher with over 8 years of experience and a background in neuroscience. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of engaging with hundreds of users around the world. I've created this podcast with the aim of providing my mentorship and educational content, offering actionable tips, knowledge, and guidance in the realm of research to anyone having an interest in this area. And I hope that you will find this episode insightful. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the show. Happy to be back, and in this episode, I will cover the topic of findability. First of all, what is findability? Findability is the fact that you can find something in a product. It can be a user interface or anything else, a system, something you use to accomplish a task. And so, findability is very important because it's at the core of our use of everyday products. One of the most famous are technological products such as smartphones or laptops, computers, television, and so on. Every time you need to interact with something to find your way, find your path towards accomplishing your task, basically. And so I want to make clear through this episode that, first of all, findability is so crucial, first of all, and second of all, that it's not so easy to evaluate it, to diagnose this, and also to correct it. So let's start from the beginning. So first of all, how can we help someone to find something? Basically, that is what findability is about. And so, in my opinion, it's the result of several things and factors that need to be considered altogether. So, there is the idea of placing the content in a way that makes sense to you. And that is information architecture. So by information architecture, you heard me talk about this several times in my podcast in the past. I love this topic because, so if you heard me talk about this, it's about how information is structured, placed, organized, in a system, in a product. And how does this structure, system, organization play a role in how users can find it? So that is really important. That is the skeleton of a user experience. It's not something you can directly see when everything is working well, but when it's not, it's the first thing that your users might criticize. So that is information architecture. And information architecture is oftentimes not seen from the outside or from the surface. But at the tip of the iceberg, we have the other component that also contributes to you finding your way, which is the UI. So the purists here will argue with me that UI is ever present. UI means user interface. What does that mean? A user interface is something that is between the user and their action with your product. For instance, if I use a smartphone, there are several user interfaces and there are several layers. so that I can accomplish my task. If I want to call a relative, I have to pick up my phone. So there is this first user interface, which is the phone itself, the case, let's say. And then I will touch with my finger on the screen. The screen is another user interface. Because we could imagine that we have a phone case and we don't have to touch through the screen. And we can just say to the phone, call my mom. And this is also a user interface. The microphone and this vocal interaction is a user interface. But imagine we touch the screen and we use the OS, operating system, to get us through this task of calling the relative. Well, this is also a user interface. And the purists will argue with me that whatever the design, it's still a user interface. So if we consider a really basic tree of nodes and links as a list, like we all know the websites of 1987, I can remember already. Well, this is also user interface. I agree. But for the sake of simplicity, in this podcast, when I will say UI, I will mean a polished and finished version of a UI, meaning as we know it today, which comes with what we call a navigational elements. Or you can have also illustrations, icons, buttons, colors, shapes, movements, and so on. And I will include all of that when I say UI. This is what I include in UI. And for me, when I talk about UI, even though it's not technically correct, I refer to a finished and polished UI. So, there is information architecture, which is putting things together so that we can find them in a way that makes sense. When you do your groceries, you will expect to find vegetables in some places and maybe fish and dairy in other places. So this is information architecture, but then we can also imagine that on top of that, the tip of the iceberg, which is what I call the UI, and the way you're led to navigate will also influence your way of finding. Probably your menu that will help you call your relative should be placed in a certain way at a certain location. But if the icon is not speaking to you, if the movement you need to do to call the relative is not speaking to you, you will not find how to do it. And on top of that, if, for instance, you need to long press an icon to have a set of options, you need to click on the three dots menu versus swipe. All of that is not solely explained by information architecture, meaning by where you place your content. Is it in category 1, category 2, category 3? It's not solely explained by that. It's another dimension, it's another factor, which is the UI. How does the color, position on the screen, the size, the let's say movement, contrast, effects, animations, icons. How does all of that contribute to the fact that I can find or not what I want to find? And so my point here is really to make clear that if you want your users to find something when they use a product, you need to consider not only information architecture. I mean, this is the very, very basic, and it's like 80%, in my opinion, of what you should care about. Maybe 50, maybe I'm exaggerating, but you should care strongly about that. But it's not the only thing. You can still mess it up if you have let's say, an incorrect UI. Or vice versa. If you start with the UI and you have a wrong information architecture, you can also mess it up in terms of helping your users find what they're looking for. And by the way, as a side note, it's oftentimes recommended to first tackle the information architecture and then to tackle the UI when you do some research and design for your product. Why is so? Because you can put as many colors and shapes and animations on a thing for which the skeleton is not good, the end product will not foster findability and will not help your users find what they're looking for. So my point, I hope, has been made. If I want to look for something and find this thing in a system, I need to know where is it located and why. And for that, I need this thing to be located in a place I expect it to be. And also, I need to have some indications of where I should look for. And so, we can already try to understand that findability, or the fact of finding something, is dependent on two things: information architecture and navigation. And so, as it is dependent on these two things, if you have a product that is quite finished with both, let's say, the information architecture in place, but also the navigation design in place, and you're wondering, okay, my users are not finding what they should be looking for or what they want to find. Imagine you're administrating an e-commerce website, and you're like, I don't know, this product is not selling. And you identified with further research that this is due to the fact that it's, I don't know, not placed well enough, not showcased enough, and so on and so forth. Well, it could be due to two reasons. It could be because this is the information architecture that is wrong, but it can also be because the navigation signifiers are also wrong. And so you need to tackle the problem from several angles. Because if you use only one methodology, you can identify one problem. But maybe if you used another one as well to identify the other pillar, you would identify the opposite. So one example could be, I test my information architecture and it's looking good. But then when I do usability tests, meaning I ask my user to interact with my prototype, my finished version of a prototype, and it's not looking so good, what can I do? Well, it means that your items are placed in a correct way, but your UI has to be improved. And so that's really, findability is really the perfect example for me to talk to you about triangulation. I will have a dedicated podcast to that, triangulation. How can you triangulate the use of your methodologies to analyze and by the way, this is a principle in life in general. The more sources you have about a topic, the more confident you will be. This is not limited to research. Well, I would say that this is research applied to real life. If someone tells you something, a fact, and it's told by this person, but you also have another group of people telling you the same thing, you also have other kind of data telling you the same thing in another way, like maybe it's numerical, maybe it's verbal, whatever, but you have several sources pointing in the same direction. You will end up thinking, okay, maybe it's true. So that's the point here. And in the case of findability, you can test it several ways. So, as I said in a previous episode, I don't know if you recall it, but I recall having talked about this really briefly, which was on the fact that card sorting is absolutely not the only way for you to explore your users' mental models, for you to pinpoint issues in your information architecture, because there are other methodologies. And doing my little review on the topic, I could say with a bit of confidence that there are at least 4 you can use, and I would say even 5. Maybe even more. Anyway, so at least 4 methodologies you can use to identify users' mental models and also understand if your navigation is going well or not. These are usability testing, card sorting, click testing, and tree testing. And I will introduce them progressively regarding how you should ideally do them, let's say, progressively at the scale of a research project. So, let's start with the beginning. Imagine you have nothing. Well, you have an idea of your product, but you don't know how you should structure the information of this product, how you should structure the content. Well, first you need to understand what are your users' mental models. In this case, you will use card sorting. Card sorting is about giving people some set of cards, basically with some labels. It can be whatever, file, edit, view, history. I'm looking at my Chrome browser right now. And it can be new tab, new window, new incognito window, and so on and so forth. And then you ask people to put these labels into categories. These categories, they can either be open. This is an open card sort. Your participants will create and name the categories themselves, or they can be assigned. And I can ask my participants, please put what for you makes sense in the following categories. Or it can be a hybrid. They can be forced to place in some categories, but they can also add theirs. And so, depending on your confidence regarding information architecture, you will go progressively from open card sort if you don't know anything at all about how it should be set, to a closed card sort in which you force your users to place content under some categories. And so, in my opinion, you should start there. You define your mental models, and then progressively, open card sort, you define the mental models of your users and how topics relate to one another. That gives you some idea on how to structure your content. The second step is the hybrid. You impose on some elements because you know that they will be used, but then they can also add some others in case you're not quite sure. And then you confirm the first layer of the information architecture with a closed card sort, because you will be able to know if the items you have are well sorted into the categories you provided. Once it's done, you can test further levels of information architecture with a tree test. It's basically asking your participants to find something in a tree. Imagine a tree with some branches, and then you ask them, where would you go to do X, Y, Z? But there is absolutely no UI here. There is absolutely no button, no color, no shape, no movement, and so on and so forth. This will allow you to test only and only the skeleton of your website. Once it's done, you can move on to the next step. The next step is, for instance, presenting an image to your participants, an image of a menu. But in this image, you also have colors, contrast, buttons, and so on. And it's only an image. And you can do that for all the layers of your website, of course. And this is called click testing. You ask your participants, where would you click in this image if you needed to do X, Y, Z? And you observe. Then you can do some statistics. You can have some heat maps, clicks, and so on. And then you can observe. But there is absolutely no interactivity. This means your users will not get distracted, and you can absolutely measure only this aspect, which is the UI, the added portion of the UI. Finally, if you have not only the first layer and you want to test interactivity, and other elements. For instance, I have to click on a three dots menu to add a song to a playlist. I have to swipe to delete the playlist. All these elements, you can neither test them with card sort, nor tree test, nor click testing. This will be usability testing. And so I would say in this funnel, it will be the last methodology that will help you identify where can users find your content. And where is the problem? Because I would go, let's say, broad at the very beginning with card sort, because how can I put that? The more you're broad, the more you're focused on your users and the less on your product. It's a balance. So you start with card sort focused on your users. They are the center of attention. You ask them, these are some labels. How would you organize them? And this is not about your product, although it is, because you're giving them some topics to sort, yes, but it's about them. It's about your users. And it's how do they relate things one to another. And progressively, as you progress through the stages that I mentioned, you get closer and closer to evaluating a product. Yes, it's still from the perspective of your user. However, the balance, in my opinion, tilts a little bit more towards the product. Because a tree test, there is more interactivity, there is more content to be showed. Click testing, it's even more, it's an image with a UI. And then even more, it's a usability test with interaction. And that's why some methodologies are called strategic and some methodologies are called tactical. The strategic part has to do with all the methodologies in which we identify from our user's perspective what are their needs without having been influenced by any kind of product whatsoever. And it's about reinventing experiences. It's about improving experiences, but it's what I would call product agnostic, which means it's not dependent on any product. If tomorrow I ask you, what is your main pain point when you use Microsoft Excel, it will already be focused on a product. If tomorrow I ask you, what is your main pain point when you handle data at work, this is not at all related with any kind of product whatsoever, at least in my question. So the less you're focused on the product, the more strategic it will be and the more it will allow you to reinvent the experience. Then the more you progress towards the evaluation of your product itself, the more it's called tactical, because the insights you will get will be a tactic. It's a specific implementation of a strategy. It's one way to solve a problem. And that's why it's called a tactic. We can have a strategy, and to accomplish this strategy, we have many tactics. And so these are smaller, let's say, solutions we have in place. And this is tested with tactical methodologies such as usability testing. So I hope that by now you understood that to evaluate the findability in a product and to identify findability issues and help improve on this topic, you need several methodologies. You need to ideally use them one after the other in a cycle. If you cannot, what I recommend and what I do oftentimes is combine them in a single test. If you imagine, you enter in a team and you're confronted tomorrow with a product that's already been designed and developed. And the stakeholders develop this first without any design, without any research. It's working, yes, but it can be improved. And so you're like, where should I start? And I have only 1 month. And I have only X amount of money. Okay, this is pretty real in this case. This is the usual scenario. What you could do, for instance, you could observe what are users' mental models related to the topics of your menu. and you can ask them to do a card sort. You could combine that with a tree test to test the importance of the structure in helping users find their content without the influence of a UI. And you could also combine that with usability testing to test the impact of the UI and then see how these things relate one to another. I would combine as much as possible if I could. Of course, the more you combine, the less deep you will go into each methodology. Of course. This is the trade-off. You should always determine what is the most important and what is my best method that I could use to answer this question. This is all for today's episode. I hope you liked it, and I hope you learned, as always, at least one thing. If this is the case, please, you can repay me, and this is free for you. It would be just by subscribing. Share the show, give me a review. That will help me improve and provide you with content that will always be useful to you and improve the quality of the show as well. I like doing this, and I would love to continue doing it for as long as possible. So thank you, take care, and see you in the next episode. Bye-bye. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you everyone for joining me today on New Exchange. I hope you found today's episode insightful and valuable. Make sure to subscribe in order for you not to miss the next episode. Share it if you liked it and leave a review. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, feel free to reach out directly to me. You can find all the details in the show notes. And see you in the next episode. Bye-bye. And